Hello everyone, welcome back, JavaMentor.net here. Let's continue with tests in this video. So in the previous video, we learned about mocking. In the video before that, we learned about unit tests. Now let's move on to the integration tests. So we said that unit test tests exactly one unit. An unit is class or a method. Integration test tests how classes or some components in your projects integrate together. So in our example, we had this car tax calculator, and in the previous video you saw that we mocked those two dependencies. But if we want to see how both car tax calculator class, person repository, and car tax repository, how those three classes works together, then we don't want to mock those two things. We want to pass real dependencies in the test, and that would be integration test for those three classes. On the other hand, if we have this situation, let's say you have some service, that service has two dependencies, and one of those two dependencies also has two dependencies. In the integration test, it's not mandatory that all dependencies are real. Let's say that you want to test integration of those three components, those three classes. You wanna create integration test for those three things. It means that you can mock those two things. Of course, you can choose to test integration of all of those classes. There is no strict rule how to choose which components in one integration test. That really depends case by case, what you really want to test, and you will see in the real world when you get some experience. But in this particular case, if you choose all of those components to do integration testing, that would basically be end-to-end testing, because that's everything. You are not mocking anything. If you're not mocking anything but you're testing from the beginning to the end, that's called end-to-end test, because you're testing from the end to another end. Of course, if you try to write integration test for those three classes, you're not mocking anything, but this car tax calculator won't be exposed from your application, right? You want to expose some controller, not your calculator. This is inside service layer. So basically you're not mocking things, but that's still not end-to-end test. End-to-end test would mean that you need to start from your controller. In our case, because we're creating web application and controller is our starting point in our application. In some other cases, maybe message that you receive from the message broker is starting point. So having said this, let's write one end-to-end test. Even better, let's start by understanding what is this test doing. So this Java Mentor application tests is what we got when we created our project using Spring Initializer. You can see that we have one test annotation on one of the methods here, and we have that class annotated with Spring Boot test. Let's try to start this and to see what will happen. And as you can see, tests are passing, but you see the Spring logo here, the same logo that we saw when we started our Spring Boot application, right? So it's saying starting Java Mentor application tests, blah blah blah, no active profile, and build successful task test. So all tests passed. What's the point? This test initialized Spring Boot context. So basically when we start one of those Spring Boot tests, our Spring context is up and running in the same fashion like when we are starting our application normally. So all beans are created, controller, repository, service, Spring does its job and wire those beans together so it injects if we take a look here, it will create book service, then it will create book controller as a Spring Bean, and then it will insert this book service through the controller inside book controller. Which means that if you screw up something in your Spring configuration, let's say here you forgot this annotation, now your application shouldn't be able to boot up, because this book controller, Spring will try to create bean of this book controller, and it will try to, if you remember, to take from the application context map this book service to insert that dependency through the constructor, but book service is not present in the application context. It's not present because it's not annotated as service. And this Spring Boot test should reveal this bug to us, hopefully. And actually our test fails. That's good. It's telling you no such bean definition, no qualifying type, bean of type book service. You see, there is no bean of type book service, and I needed that book service error creating bean name with name book controller, so I tried to create this bean, but I was unable, and the reason is that there is no qualifying bean of type book service. So let's summarize one more time. This test is trying to start to boot up whole application context of Spring, and then start what's inside the test. Let's revert back this, so now it should work. And let's explain 3 ways how you can do dependency injection in Spring. This is not strictly related to tests, it's related to Spring, but I now realize that we didn't talk about those 3 ways a few videos ago, so we are talking about it now. So we said that Spring is using constructor to do dependency injection. It's injecting this repository through the constructor inside service, right? But that's not the only way. Even without constructor, dependency injection can work, but then we need to mark this field as with this auto-wired annotation. What this means is that Spring will directly auto-wire this dependency on this field. So Spring is basically doing this book service, so it creates an instance and then it injects dependencies through the field. Of course, instead of new book repository, it will take a repository from the application context. But you will notice that this book repository is marked as private. It has private access, so it's a good, we are inside book service class, and that's why we can see this book repository here. But if we try this injection here, for example, this book repository will be red because we cannot outside private field, we cannot access private fields outside of the book service class. So how can Spring do that? Good question. Spring is using Java reflection. We won't cover that, but it's important for you to know. Back to the topic. So you can do dependency injection through the constructor. You can do this way through the field, and the third way is using setter. So in that way, you want to put setter annotation here on the setter. Of course, if you want constructor injection, you can also put auto-wired on the constructor, and this will work normally. Just the thing is that newer versions of Spring, they detect by default when constructor is present, so this auto-wired annotation is not mandatory. But for other 2 type of injection, field injection and setter injection, that auto-wired annotation is mandatory. Okay, I wrote one end-to-end test for our book controller. So we want to check if we try to hit our /books endpoint, will we get the proper response? So if we pass real author ID, and we can take a look in our database, we have 1 book in the database. Author ID is 199 for that book. So if we try to pass 199, will we receive one book as a response? And we want to test everything in the way: controller, service, repository, so everything. That's end-to-end test. I wrote that test. Let's explain what's going on here. First of all, we need one helper for this purpose. So we said, hey, please, because this helper is handy when you are doing testing. You don't need this helper in normal, when you start your application in normal mode, only for testing. So when we are doing Spring Boot test, we are saying, hey, please configure this mock MVC. So this annotation is mandatory. Then, when this mock MVC is configured, we want to auto-wire that mock MVC to this field. And then we are using this in a similar fashion like you would use Postman. So we are trying to hit some endpoint and we are passing a request parameter author ID. By the way, I changed this author ID from the request body to request param because passing a request body in the get method is not a good idea and it's not by standards. You can check that online. I won't explain that any further, but anyway, passing a request body in get method is not a good idea. Remember that. Okay, so we are passing author ID as a request param, and then we expect that result status will be okay, and we expect that JSON that we will return, that we will get from this call, first element of the JSON, ISBN of the first element will be this, and author ID of the first element will be this. Well, we will only receive one element, so yeah, that's basically it. Now, the syntax is not that important. You can do this in a few other ways. Mock MVC is not the only way. The point of this is that you understand that whole context is up and running when we try to run our test. As you can see in the log, Spring logo is shown. You can try start this in the debug mode and you can put breakpoint in any component, like in controller, in service, in repository. You will see that you will stop by every breakpoint because this test is going through everything. Nothing is mocked. And that's your first end-to-end test. Congratulations! In the next video, let's talk about test coverage and why is that important. Also, we will configure Jacoco so we can see test coverage on our project. See you in the next video.